coming up on Shoppers Politics.
Oliver Letwin, having stood down as an MP in 2019, we haven't heard from you for a bit, but we heard a lot from you in 2019 about Brexit.
I prefer to forget the whole ghastly episode.
Have you made your peace with the party? I hope you have, with the Tory party.
No, I haven't made my peace with it, but I'm not at war with it either. I'm leaving it to its own devices, and it's leaving me to my own devices. I'm concerning myself with other things.
Hello, I'm Christopher Hope, chopper to my pals, and this is Choppers Politics. On today's programme, we're getting down to brass tacks on tax. This week saw the Prime Minister take one of the biggest political gambles of his premiership, raising taxes to their highest level since the Second World War. Yes, Boris Johnson abandoned not one, but two of his flagship manifesto pledges from 2019 in a £36 billion move to reduce soaring NHS waiting lists and tackle the social care crisis. Now, we'll dig into that with two of this week's guests. Plus, we'll chat to pollster extraordinaire Martin Baxter about the health of the Conservatives ahead of party conference season. And if the state of the postbag here in Telegraph Towers is anything to go by, people are not happy. But first, let's turn to Chloe Smith, Cabinet Office Minister and MP for Norwich North. Chloe kindly joined me in our regular haunt, the Red Lion pub in Westminster, to discuss two new bills that controversially could see you having to show your passport just to vote. Chloe Smith, Cabinet Office Minister, welcome to Choppers Politics.
Fantastic to be with you.
Great to see you, and you look so well. And you've had some difficulty during lockdown.
Well, thanks very much. I mean, I'm back with a bang, like everyone is this week, but also doubly for me because I've done my bit fighting cancer and now fighting fit.
And you tweeted cheerio to breast cancer in June, and you're all clear, and that is the best thing. So, big week for you. You got two bits of big bills going through Parliament this week.
Yeah, not a small in tray. So one of them repeals the Fixed Term Parliament Act, and the other one is the Elections Bill, which does a whole set of things to keep our elections secure and fair, transparent, up-to-date and inclusive.
And one of them will actually axe the Fixed Term Parliament Act. It'll mean that you can have an election whenever, doesn't it?
That's right. So it's a return to the tried and tested arrangements, if you like. It's a return to the constitution of the past, which we know works. And I think that was the point about the Fixed Term Parliament Act. In the end, it didn't work.
So I've got to ask you a question from Mrs Hope. When's the election?
I'm afraid Mrs Hope and Brenda from Bristol will have to see on that, because we'll be doing that repeal legislation. That will be finished soon enough. But of course, the point of that is that although we will still have elections in this country at a maximum of 5 years apart, it puts the power back with the Prime Minister of the day to be able to call an early election if that's needed, if there were a crisis of some kind, which is, as I say, what we saw didn't work about the old arrangements in 2019. Are you
printing your leaflets yet in Norwich?
No, I'm not. But of course, as a good constituency MP, I've got some going out anyway, because we keep in touch with the electorate year round.
Of course you do. But on the leaflets, the big point there is that the other part of the legislation you're doing is how to make sure that leaflets online, like on Facebook notices, are actually put out there by genuine people engaged in democracy.
Yeah, that's right. And this is one of the really good and important things in this bill. And actually, one of the things that I think other countries have found it quite difficult to do so far. So I hope we're at the front of the pack with this. It will give much greater transparency for voters, knowing who is campaigning online. And you'll be able to see that on election material, on political material.
What will it say then? The bottom of these leaflets, it says promoted by somebody in a party. Will have a named person.
Yeah, that's right. Broadly similar.
And that will mean you can't have this fear of Russians with Facebook messages trying to sort of swing an election to one party or a different party.
Well, it's a genuine concern, isn't it? And there's a couple of things in this bill that keep our elections secure. There's another element of it which seeks to push foreign money out of our politics, and that's really important.
Is it a big problem? Foreign money, for example, is that a problem? There are strict rules on donations.
There are already. That's exactly the point. So we're building from what's there already in election law, which is that you have to have a legitimate interest in the UK to be able to take part and to donate.
What does that mean? Living here or business interests here, or what does it mean?
Well, broadly, although slightly different things in different parts of the question, but broadly, you have to be able to be eligible to be on the electoral register. Just finishing off the point about foreign influence, I think people do want to know that actually our debate and our democracy are being influenced by those who have a legitimate interest in doing so.
But there's no actual evidence it ever happened, was there? And all that rowing about the referendum in 2016, there were investigations into that found that Russians really weren't involved at all. There was a fraction of tweets sent out by Russian bots.
Well, I think the point is people want to make sure that our democracy is fit for the future at any time, don't we? It's not necessarily
about... There's no election been unsafe so far, is there?
Well, we think it's...
Well, has there? I mean, tell me.
We have not seen evidence of successful interference in our elections, and that is critical to be able to say. But the point about this bill is, here we stand as the stewards of quite a fantastic democratic heritage, but we need to be able to keep it that way. And so there's several things in this bill that do that. This is one of them. Another one of them is the measures on voter identification, which again is something that people, I think, have every right to expect, that their vote is theirs and theirs alone, and we're making sure of that in this bill so that it's that way for the future.
It's basically done on trust now, voting, isn't it? You turn up and say, I'm Christopher Hope of this place in England, and they say, yes, you are. I mean, I take along my polling card, but that's not even required to vote at the moment, is it?
That's the point. There's a test of identity already in the polling station, which is as Victorian as this pub may be. And the point is, it's not enough just to be able to say your name and address in the modern world. That could easily be faked, and that's not right. So we're doing a very simple thing, very reasonable thing, asking somebody to bring photo identification. It's done in many other countries, Canada, the Netherlands, around the world. It's a perfectly common sense solution.
Have you worked out how many people might be disenfranchised by this?
We know that 98% of the population have the ID that will be asked for, and for anybody that doesn't, we're making sure there's a free local voter card. So I think we need to be really careful with our words here. Disenfranchisement is not the question at all. And for what it's worth, I think the Labour Party is really foolish in saying things like voter suppression. I think that's outrageous language, and it only serves to scare people. What we're doing here is a very, very sensible policy that will be firmly inclusive, and just in case, we're making sure there is this free local voter card.
2% is a lot, though. That's hundreds of thousands of people.
And that's why we're laying plans, as I say, for the free local voter card. And that's where, actually, perfectly understandably, the costs of this policy come in. So some people say, well, isn't this policy a lot of money to spend on something that you don't need to spend on? First of all, we do need to spend on it because actually democracy is important, and you do need to pay to get it right. Secondly, we are making sure that within the costs of this scheme, we're laying these arrangements so that everybody can take part, because that is the fundamental, isn't it? Our democracy is there for everyone, so fraud measures have to make sure that it is, but also by the same token, the arrangements in place have to be inclusive, which is what they are.
You have raised the bar on voting that wasn't there before, and that's what Labour are worried about, isn't it? That more people might be put off from voting.
I disagree with that entirely. Everybody eligible to vote will be able to do so, will have every chance to do so. In fact, in some ways, you could almost say this is a really good chance to communicate more with people about our elections. Let's get participation up, because people will have confidence in our elections from this measure.
What measures are you taking to tackle postal vote fraud, which is a big issue, certainly for the minority parties? You know, Nigel Farage was forever talking about it, wasn't he, in the old days?
Well, that's in this bill as well. So we've got measures here about postal vote fraud and proxy voting as well. This is really important. We are going to be able to crack down on postal vote harvesting. Don't know if you
What's that?
Well, postal vote harvesting is something that campaigners might be able to do. If they went round door to door and gathered up postal votes and said, we'll just post those for you, that's fine.
It can't be legal.
Well, you laugh, Chris, but actually there is in existence a Labour Party manual advising their campaigners to build their own ballot box to do exactly that. Now, that is the kind of thing that I would really advise against, and that is going to be firmly outlawed by this bill. And we're also making sure that the secrecy of the ballot provisions are extended to postal and proxy voting, quite right, because people need to have that confidence that if they are the victim of a fraud crime, that can be called out and prosecuted.
To what extent, though, are you trying to impose restrictions and red tape on the act of voting, when it basically it's only a problem in a minority of parts of the country? Why not bring in these measures where it's a problem, as opposed to inflict it on the entire country?
Well, first of all, this is not a burden on voting. This is going to be a very reasonable and straightforward procedure. People will be easily able to bring their own ID that they already have. 98% of people already have it, or the free local voter card. But I want to make really clear here that there is evidence of electoral fraud that's happened in our own country. Now, by that I mean the history in Northern Ireland, where, of course, we've actually already got this scheme in place, and it has cracked down on it. That's the important point. We can see that it's worked. Let's bring it to the rest of the country as well. But more than that, we also see the evidence base in Tower Hamlets, in Birmingham, in Slough. You see it happening. And in Parliament this week, you heard lots of MPs talking about what they still see nowadays.
Down in those areas, then? Why do it
Because
everywhere?
Democracy, quite rightly, has to be universal. Actually, there's a really simple philosophical answer to that. But the point is, these measures do address that evidence base. I have no time at all for the argument that there isn't evidence of this fraud. Firstly, I've just listed it off. But secondly, these crimes are crimes of deception. None of us, I hope, should think that a criminal should have 2 votes and their victim has none. Of course, that is the crime we're talking about. So we need to be able to eliminate the possibility of that happening, and that is what you should expect in your elections.
And there are votes too now for more expats. That's the other part.
Well, this is another part of the bill which I'm really, really proud of, being able to deliver after some blocks on this for quite some time, actually, in Parliament. You'll be aware of the history of this bill. The idea is that British citizens overseas should still be able to participate in our democracy. They do already. It's a principle that's established, but actually they're limited from doing that up until 15 years having lived abroad. We are lifting that limit so people can continue to participate, as is their right and as is this established principle. And I actually really welcome that. I think that's going to be a flourishing.
Even though they're not paying tax in this country, they can vote in this country.
Well, Chris, as a historian, you'll know that actually taxation and representation don't go quite so closely together as the saying goes. But the point is, actually, British citizens abroad do have strong interests back in this country, quite rightly. Foreign policy, taxation policy, pension policy, you name it. There are a number of things that are quite rightly, legitimately of interest to them.
On tax, you won the election in December 2019. Did you campaign and say you wouldn't be increasing national insurance contributions if you're returned to Parliament?
Well, Chris, that's a very good question that you know that any Conservative MP would have to say yes to. But as the Prime Minister was clear this week, the pandemic was hardly in our manifesto either. It's not comfortable having to have made, so many shifts and accommodations to unexpected events that have happened in the last few years. And goodness, from a personal perspective, as I say, I've made a few shifts myself to unexpected events in that
shift,
time.
Though. I mean, the base is furious about it. We've got all sorts of people in the Telegraph this week saying how upset they are. What's your message to them? Do you think they should just wake up to the reality of a post-COVID world?
Well, I think there's a number of things. I think first of all, we do all have to be realistic about the reality of about the practicalities of a post-COVID world, which is that we have had to spend a great deal of money so far, and we need to be able to answer that in budgeting. We do, sadly, have a backlog in the NHS then, which does need to be addressed. And again, with personal experience, I think that's incredibly important for other cancer sufferers who might be anxious about that in the years to come. And also, I'm sure that many Telegraph readers and listeners will be intimately aware of the problems in social care. Those need to be fixed as well. And this scheme, I think, does that in a way that has taken a responsible look across the options for how and chosen one that will work.
This this money which will be going towards the levy, the NHS social care levy, that will just go up and up. There'll be an arms race to increase that every election, won't there? It'll become another burden on taxpayers. Well,
I think the key point here is that we've set out a design that we think will be responsible and will be fair and will be workable. Certainly, as I say, in terms of for example, the backlog part of this, I'm really reassured by that, and I think that's going to meet a lot of people's needs, which is critically important. I think there will no doubt be further pretty tricky decisions that the Chancellor has to take in the spending review, in the budget to come. And, as the tone you've set in these questions, we've got to be realistic about what these years that we're living through
and we get to hear a Labour answer on what they would do.
I think that's been clear from this week, yeah.
Do you worry, though, that you've lost the reason to be a Conservative? What is a Tory now? If you don't believe, or if you're voting for tax hikes and breaking manifesto pledges, what's the point of being a Tory?
No, I don't worry about that, Chris, is the short answer, because, for example, the Conservative tradition is also really clear about the need to pragmatically govern and meet the circumstances responsibly, and I think anybody could see that in what we've been setting out this week. Secondly, I see in our Prime Minister one of the most robust Conservatives that you could seek to be led by in Parliament. And thirdly, let's just look again at the measures that we've been talking about in the rest of this interview. Here is a Conservative government standing up for the things that are needed to keep our democracy safe and our elections secure. I'm very proud to be a Conservative this week doing all of these things.
The critics say to us, Chloe Smith, that it's just all you're doing is moving money from one pot to the other. It's moving from a private pot to a public pot, but the problem remains that the social care sector is still not equipped to deal with the problem. There's a big backlog in staff numbers, there's issues with capacity. How will you lift that up to deal with the actual problem rather than how it's paid for?
Well, you're quite right. There's levels of detail here that will now need to be addressed. What the Prime Minister has done this week, and why I think it's admirable, is that he's had the guts to set out the major philosophical position that says, here's what we believe in, practical position that says, here's how we're going to do it, followed by the responsible position, which is we'll fill out these detailed questions that you're asking. Quite understandably, people want to know those things, and we will make sure those are in place. Well,
Chloe Smith, Cabinet Office Minister, thank you for joining us this week back in the Red Lion Pub, and it's great to see you looking so well. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Chloe Smith there. Right, don't go anywhere. In just one moment, we'll be back talking polls and tax with Martin Baxter, the co-founder of election expert Electoral Calculus. Right after this.
Was Churchill the hero of the Second World War or a racist imperialist whose actions led to the Bengal famine? Should his statue be protected or pulled down? And can we really judge the figures of the past with the attitudes of the present?
Please to apply for planning permission to have the statue removed.
My name is Stephen Edgington, and if you're enjoying this podcast, you might like History Defended, a new series from the Telegraph. In each episode, a leading historian defends a controversial historical figure. I play devil's advocate.
There are some times in wartime when incredibly difficult decisions of life and death have to be taken.
Winston Churchill, Clive of India, Bomber Harris, and Oliver Cromwell, men whose actions still influence the world we live in today.
Today is Victory in Europe Day.
Search History Defended in the same place you're listening to this.
Now, you heard there Chloe Smith defending the government's increases in taxes, breaking manifesto pledges from the 2019 general election. So we thought we should find out, what do voters think? One man who knows is Martin Baxter, the co-founder of pollster Electoral Calculus. We asked Martin to look at the state of the parties as they prepare to gather for their party conferences. Has tax been a bearing on their popularity? Helped by pollster company Find Out Now, Electoral Calculus ran a poll early this week for this podcast that took into account the responses of 10,000 people. And listeners, it doesn't look great for some big Tory names. Martin Baxter from Electoral Calculus, welcome back to Choppers Politics. How are you?
Very well. Hi, Chris.
You've been looking at the state of the parties as we go into party conference season for the Telegraph, haven't you?
Yes, that's right. We've done a special poll, especially for the Telegraph, and it's quite a special poll as well. It is a sample of more than 10,000 people, so that's larger than normal polls. And we're using this new technology called MRP that lets us predict not just the nationwide support for each of the parties, but the likely result in every seat, so that we can get a prediction for Parliament as well as the headline prediction.
And Martin Baxter, you've carried out this polling, haven't you, just as the public have been understanding and working out their reaction to this increase in taxes from Boris Johnson?
Yes, that's right. We were doing the polling on Monday, Tuesday and Wednesday of this week, which was as the tax rises were being pre-announced and announced on Tuesday and discussed on Wednesday. They will have had time to filter a bit into many people's voting intentions.
And you found some alarming numbers there for the Tories.
Yes, that overall the Conservatives are down about 8% on our figures from where they were at the general election, down to 37% support from 45%, and that gives them a lead of just about 4% over the Labour Party, which is still a lead but less than it's been during most of this year when we had the vaccine boost bolster the government's fortunes. The tax changes so far do not seem to have translated into big popularity for the government, indeed almost the reverse. And in terms of number of seats in Parliament, which is of course a key thing for if there were a general election tomorrow, the Conservatives on our figures would be short of an overall majority. They would have 311 seats, and remember you need 326 for an outright majority, so that's 15 short.
Oh my lord. Hung Parliament territory, can't believe it. Another bloody coalition, Martin.
It could be. Obviously, there's a bit of uncertainty either way. It might be a little bit better or a little bit worse, but that's certainly a big change from December 2019 when it was a Conservative majority of about 80 seats.
Looking at your numbers here, we'll put this onto the website and the show notes of this episode. Would it be possible for Labour to form a coalition on these current predictions with left-leaning parties? I'm trying to add all the numbers up in my head and I can't do it.
It's quite tight. If you add Labour and the Scottish Nationalists and the Welsh Nationalists and the Liberals, then you're going to get to, I think it's still not quite enough. It would be 320. So you get Caroline Lucas in as well, and perhaps Sinn Féin continue not to attend Westminster. You're getting close. Equally, it's easily within the margin of error that Labour could form a minority government. So they just need a little bit more than where they are at the moment, and then it would be possible to build up a coalition. And that's certainly a change from where we've been all this year, where it's predicted to be Conservative majorities. The last time we ran this poll for the Telegraph was back in May, just after the local elections, and then it was a very large majority for the Conservatives. So what our figures are showing is that there's been a change in the support for the Conservatives and a reduction. Labour are kind of doing okay, been a bit of a growth in the other parties, maybe for the Lib Dems and the Greens a bit, but the Conservatives are doing less well on this poll that pollsters Find Out Now conducted for us earlier this week.
And Martin Baxter, you last did this kind of research for Telegraph back in May. What was the forecast majority for Boris Johnson then?
So back in May, we had a forecast general election majority for the Conservatives of 122 seats, with them winning 386 seats. That's over 200 seats more than Labour, and polling about 13% more than Labour as a lead in the national vote. So that 13% has now dropped to 4 on our figures, and the majority has disappeared. So it's certainly, if a week is a long time in politics, then 3 months is even longer.
How much, to be charitable to the Tory party, can we put this down to the manifesto-busting announcements this week on tax and pension?
Well, that's hard to say because we didn't ask a question directly on tax. There may be more polling on that in the coming days, and we might see more about what's driving it. It's a little bit of a coincidence, isn't it, that we're polling as this tax announcement is in the news and the Conservatives are not doing so well. So there's got to be the suspicion that the tax may be playing a part of this.
And what's interesting from your numbers, and again, they'll be in the show notes for this episode, is that it's not really Labour that's benefiting. It's the Greens are up 5 points, the Reform Party, which is a minority party run by Richard Tice, up 2 points, and Lib Dems up 1 point. So why isn't Keir Starmer benefiting?
Well, one has to speculate a bit on that, but there's been a sort of perception that there's not a kind of huge amount of energy and clear positioning from Labour. You might say they're not very exciting at the moment. And equally, on the tax, Labour's not got anything particular message that seems to be coming out very clearly. So I'm guessing perhaps some anti-tax Conservatives are maybe going to the Reform Party, and then maybe there's a sort of general runaround that's benefiting the smaller parties mid-election. But ultimately, everybody has to remember by the time we get to the general election that under the first-past-the-post electoral system, if you don't vote for one of the two major parties, it might be quite hard to get your candidates elected. So the people supporting Lib Dems Reform and the Greens may be disappointed. So there's another issue that we might see nearer the time about electoral pacts and whether any of those make sense for parties, because you can't really run a multi-party system in a first-past-the-post electoral method. Every general election, people seem to kind of wake up to this fact and get a bit cross on it, and Twitter and so on, but it is a fact, so people have to work with that.
And Martin, just going through the names of the Tory MPs who might disappear from our political scene, the only cabinet casualty I can see is Alistair Jack, who's the Scottish Secretary. But big names, Ian Duncan Smith in Chingford and Woodford Green, Theresa Villiers from Chipping Barnet, and a host of Redwall seats will turn, well, from blue to red, won't they? Richard Holden, for example, and others. I mean, it's going to be quite a big moment. I wonder if these MPs are aware what could be the electoral effect on this week's announcements on their political futures.
Well, I'm sure they're always conscious of their local political situation. Yes, there's other names I spot as well. Steve Baker, chairman of the European Research Group, of course, in the Brexit days, might be in trouble in Wickham, and Alan Cairns, the former Welsh secretary in Vale of Glamorgan. Scotland's a little more complicated because there may well be pro-unionist tactical voting, which our figures don't take account on. So it might not be as bad in Scotland as the figures suggest. But certainly Conservatives are predicted to lose a lot of seats in the North West, Wales, London and the East Midlands, mostly to the benefit of Labour in those cases. I'm sure MPs will be thinking about it and wondering exactly what the best way through is. Although you said only one cabinet minister scheduled to lose their seat, in some of the numbers, Dominic Raab might be in a little bit of trouble in Esher with the Lib Dems. Lib Dems trying slightly hard to predict. We think he's probably all right at the moment, but it's not a clear-cut case.
Well, certainly the Lib Dems have been targeting Dominic Raab's seat for a while, and that will alarm the Foreign Secretary. Well, Martin Baxter, it's been great to have you on again on Choppers Politics. Thank you.
You're welcome, Chris. Thanks.
Now, my final guest this week will be remembered by listeners of this podcast as the man behind the eponymous Letwin Amendment. Back in 2019, amid the Brexit chaos, you couldn't really escape, could you? Oliver Letwin from the airwaves. Well, his days as an MP and a Brexit botherer are behind him, and instead he's taken to writing books. Oliver Letwin, welcome to Choppers Politics. You have a new book out called China versus America, A Warning. It appears to be keen to warn about the risk of taking on China, which goes against the current flow of politics, doesn't it?
Yes, I'm afraid that at the moment, both in Beijing and in Washington, and indeed in London and some other Western capitals, people are gearing up for an increasingly frosty Cold War. And what my book tries to point out is that this could all too easily lead to something much worse. I think we're therefore on a very worrying trajectory, and I think we need to alter that course by trying to find some way not of being naive about the Chinese, who are, as I point out in the book, already the second great power in the world and almost inevitably will quite soon be the greatest power in the world, and who do not share many of our values, and whose human rights record is abysmal. But I think at the same time as not being naive, we need to accept that somehow or other these great powers need to live together in this world.
So from a UK perspective, hasn't that failed so far? There's concern about Chinese influencing universities, the Huawei involvement in our next generation 5G is being wound back. Don't you think this was almost a treatise for when David Cameron and George Osborne were in power for 10 years ago, when you were advising them, and we've moved on from that now? Or do you think we need to re-engage with them?
I definitely think we need to re-engage. I think this is a treatise for these times, not those times. In those times, the Beijing line was much less hard. The Washington line was less hard. There was less danger and more opportunity for talking. We are now in a much trickier situation, to put it mildly.
Do you think we take too much direction from America? Because the hawks in the White House, certainly under Trump, were very concerned about our position on Huawei and others.
Well, it isn't just the hawks in the Trump administration. As I point out, actually, there is a bipartisan movement in the United States. There are plenty of people in the US that are worried about the direction, but they're not very influential in Washington at the moment, either side of the political divide between Republicans and Democrats. And the Biden administration, although it's much more diplomatic in its language and less prone to engage in sudden outbursts, actually has a pretty settled policy, pretty similar to that of the previous regime vis-à-vis China. And of course, the Chinese position hasn't altered at all. So yes, I do think there is a misconception in the UK. I think rather than just lining up behind the US in some sort of, I think, rather failed attempt to browbeat the Chinese into some kind of submission, we would be much better off trying to influence our partners and allies, both in the US and in the rest of the West, to try to engage with China in the areas where we can. And the argument I make in the book is there's no point in trying to take on directly the many flashpoints. We're not going to solve the manifold crises in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, the Himalayas, Bangladesh, many other parts of the world where we and the Chinese have conflicting interests in the next little while, because the relations are much too bad to do that. What we can do is to cooperate in areas where actually there is common ground and where the world simply can't tackle the problems without such cooperation. So, for example, we are not going to resolve issues of climate change without cooperating with the Chinese. We're not going to deal with issues to do with energy resources or global health protection, as we saw with COVID, or many of these other issues which are common problems for humanity, unless the West and China can work together. And if we do work together on those, notwithstanding the very great differences of value and viewpoint, I think gradually we can build up some kind of limited trust, which might then enable us, some years from now, to begin to engage on these really tricky conflicts of interest.
And that could start this November with the COP conference in Glasgow. Alok Sharma is in Beijing this week, isn't he?
Yes, it's an ideal opportunity. I mean, first of all, COP26 is going to be a complete wet blanket unless the US and China can agree on what's to be done. I mean, we all know that without those two players playing in the same direction, nothing happens. If COP26 can be made a success, that begins to build some degree of understanding of how to do business with one another and some degree of renewed trust. And I think the next obvious thing on the agenda is global health protection. It is very clear that the WHO system failed in COVID. And actually, those of us who'd seen it operating in Ebola knew that it was not in good shape.
Weren't they conflicted? I mean, without going too hard on the WHO, there was concerns in America that they were too conflicted with China. They were reluctant to criticise China. I mean, there's a lack of trust, isn't there, about where did COVID come from?
Well, of course there is. But the truth is what actually happened was that the Chinese had spent a very large amount of time getting themselves properly embedded in the UN institutions other than the Security Council, while the Americans were asleep on the job. In much the same way as Afghanistan has now been given to the Chinese as a sort of protectorate, and with it, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan and so on, China has essentially gained huge degrees of influence in that part of the world. In just the same way, they've actually gained huge degrees of influence over the minor UN operations. And that's one of the reasons why the WHO system didn't work. But another reason why it didn't work is much more profound, which is the WHO isn't properly constructed to deal with today's global disease spread. And the only way we're going to get any proper arrangements, and Jim O'Neill, for example, suggested some much better arrangements involving the IMF and a global health board at the G20. You're not going to get those set up without doing business with the Chinese. And we are not going to prevent the next pandemic unless we stop arguing about this last one and start working out together, however much we distrust one another at the moment, how we can together make a system that will actually warn us all properly and enable us to fend off these diseases before they become pandemics.
But how can you get close to a country which has repressed democracy in Hong Kong and is treating the Uyghurs so appallingly? I mean, that's the problem, isn't it? So it's all very well saying this, we need more of this rapprochement with China, but to do that, you've got to get round and get past these big human rights issues.
No, my argument is precisely you don't. There's no point in trying to pretend away the fact that the Chinese have a completely different system from ours, and one of which, in some respects, we very, very strongly disapprove. And while we're at it, we have a system which they very strongly disapprove of, and they disapprove of the way we treated them for 250 years. There are lots of things that are conflicts between us and them, and we can't pretend them away. And we have to go into this open-eyed. However, having said that, it's perfectly possible to do business with people you really profoundly disapprove of in some respects. And we did that for many years in a way that just about held the world away from hot war with the Soviet Union, which was a much worse tyranny even than this. So you can do business with people you don't approve of, as long as they're not trying to destroy you. And I don't think that for all the problems about the way that China is run, there's any evidence that it actually wants to displace the whole of Western democracy and invade the West and run the whole world. That's not its history. With the exception of the Mongols, it's never done that. I don't think there's any sign that it now wants to do it. What it wants to be is the other great player. It has a sort of G2 view of the world. And if we're willing to do business on that basis, I think we can do business with them.
Now, Oliver Letwin, having stood down as an MP in 2019, we haven't heard from you for a bit, but we heard a lot from you in 2019 about Brexit. I'm trying to ask you what you think of what's going on at the moment. It looks like perpetual fudge was agreed this week with the extension of the issue of meat travelling to and from between GB and Northern Ireland. Are we set for long-term fudge as far as you can see it?
I'm not close enough to it now to know what to predict. If there is long-term fudge, as you put it, that would be not a bad outcome. My fear has always been that instead of fudge, there sets about being conflict and then all hell breaks loose in the island of Ireland. As long as people can keep talking and as long as they can keep fudging, that may be quite a good solution.
Yes. Did you keep a diary during all those epic days you choreographed in Parliament?
Absolutely not. I prefer to forget the whole ghastly episode.
Have you made your peace with the party? I hope you have, with the Tory party.
No, I haven't made my peace with it, but I'm not at war with it either. I'm leaving it to its own devices, and it's leaving me to my own devices. I'm concerning myself with other things.
And you've been following the news on taxation over the past couple of days, I imagine. Did the idea of ever increasing NICs come to you when you were looking at social care 10 years ago, when Andrew Dilnot's report came back?
Well, I mean, people have discussed the possibility of raising either one tax or another or national insurance to deal with this question of the Dilnot cap for as long as I can recall. I don't think actually that solving the problem of inheritance by people whose parents have expensive property is tackling the main issue. The main issue here is not the question of inheritance. It's the question of how we prevent many hundreds of thousands of our fellow citizens from being inadequately looked after, both at home and when they go into residential care. And I'm afraid this policy does absolutely nothing to resolve that crux issue. And that was the whole problem about the Dilnot report and why I didn't think we ought to implement it and why I don't think it's sensible to implement it now. It just absorbs a huge amount of money that would be much better spent on enabling people to be properly looked after.
But surely to get there, you start with the money. So you find the money to pay for that care.
This money, Chris, won't put a single extra penny into looking after people. It literally won't put a single extra penny in. What it will do is to mean that people don't have to pay for it in a way that reduces the inheritance of their children. So the taxpayer is paying what individuals at the moment are paying under these proposals. It's the same amount of money, just comes from a different source. Whereas what's actually needed is a large amount of additional money available to people who can't afford to provide proper care for themselves. So what happens is that Mrs. Jones is very ill and very frail, and she's in bed at home, and she gets wholly inadequate domiciliary care at the moment. People do not come to her for more than 15 minutes in the morning and 15 minutes in the afternoon. And the next thing that happens is she has to go into residential care. And this is miserable for her family, And it's very costly in the long run. And the reason is the local authorities can't afford to give her adequate care. And the reason is there's enough taxpayer money to do it. That's the real problem. And all this is doing is shuffling around who pays contributions for residential care when people have quite a large number of assets. What the current proposals will do is protect those assets so they can be inherited by their children, and it will not bring a single extra penny into social care. I really regard that as a very, very poor policy.
So what you're saying is there needs to be an actual plan for social care or to increase the scale of the sector to provide the support for the lady you mentioned there. There's this huge backlog of staff who can't get into the sector and the rest of it. So you need to have more, just a bigger sector, and this won't supply that.
Correct. It's not even trying to. That's not the aim of the policy.
Right. Well, Oliver Letwin, on that sad note, it's been great to have you on to talk about your book. It's called China versus America, A Warning. It's out by Back right now. Please do have a look at it. It's an interesting take, a different take, and also an antidote maybe to some of the hawkish views on China we're seeing a lot of them at the top of government. Oliver Letwin, thank you for joining us this week. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, that's all for this week, listeners. Thanks to my guests, Chloe Smith, MP, Sir Oliver Letwin, and of course Martin Baxter. Thank you as well to my producers, Louisa Wells, Giles Gear, and Theo Luludis. But most importantly of all, thank you to you for listening. And to show my gratitude, why not go to telegraph.co.uk/chopper, and you'll get your first month subscription to the Telegraph completely free of charge. And then the next 2 months for just 50p a month. Don't say I don't treat you. And of course, don't forget to sign up to my new newsletter called Chopper's Politics. It brings you everything you need to know about what's happening in Westminster each lunchtime straight to your inbox. Go to telegraph.co.uk/newsletters to sign up. And finally, please do buy a copy of the Daily Telegraph if you can. Until next time though, cheerio!